Now, our next speaker, Ginger Goodin, is going to talk. She's from the Texas Transportation Institute, and she's going to talk to us about Texas transportation funding, and I hope she tells us why so much of Texas gas taxes are diverted to education instead of highways.
All right, good morning. I am going to give an overview of transportation funding in Texas, and I'm going to focus at the state level. My colleague, Mr. Heiligenstein, I think will provide some information about what's happening at the regional or local level, but I'm going to focus on the state. And I will tell you that usually when I talk to a group about transportation funding, first of all, we find it very difficult to get people engaged in talking about transportation, amazingly. And my colleague Trey Baker, who's going to speak on a later panel, is going to really talk about what we've heard from the public about their understanding of transportation. But then when you talk about transportation funding, really people start to glaze over. I am a fan of a podcast that's called Intelligence Squared. Has anybody ever heard of that? Okay, a few people. And so it's a debate format where it's a traditional debate format, not like a lot of debates we see these days. Two people arguing for and against a motion. And the one that I heard this week was the motion was to increase the federal fuel tax to fund infrastructure. And actually, Baruch, your colleague, Adrian Moore, was there arguing against the motion. Well, at the end of the debate, the moderator said, to be honest, when we put together this motion and it began to crystallize, and we had the word infrastructure in there and funding, I really thought this was going to be problematic. But he said, I never imagined that it would get so crazy and so passionate with accusations of quoting people out of context and assertions that the gentleman from Colorado was smoking something. And so it just goes to show, I think that transportation funding can be a very exciting and engaging topic. So there are 3 points that I hope to leave you with today. The first is, and Vance set me up really well for this, when you look at what's happening with the economy. We are blessed with an incredible economy in the state, but with that comes some significant transportation challenges. And what we know is that the needs that we have for improving the transportation system far outweigh the revenue that we're taking in. The second point is that our legislature in the last 2 sessions has taken some significant steps to close that near-term funding gap without raising taxes. And the third point is that when you look long-term, there will continue to be some funding challenges, especially with the projected growth in the state. We're projected to double in population between now and 2040. With that population growth comes more vehicles, more congestion. And so we're going to continue to have a gap, and that gap is going to grow. And some of the tools that have been used in the state, including tolling, public-private partnerships, as well as debt financing, raising taxes, all of those, the support is really questionable. And particularly in the area of tolling, how will we continue to do tolling? Because there is a declining support for that strategy. So just to give you a little bit of context, this is just some information about what Texans are facing. An average of 40 hours of delay taken out of their time every year, and a cost of $1,000 per year in lost time, fuel costs, et cetera. And this is how we got here. What we've seen in the last 40 years is a doubling of the population, a tripling of the number of vehicles on the road, more than triple the amount of miles traveled, and a very small increase in the amount of highway space. And there's a number of reasons for that. Funding is one of them, and I'll talk a little bit more about the major source of funding, which has been the fuel tax, and what the problems have been with that. But we can't forget about safety too, because we continue to have more than 3,000 people a year die on Texas highways and roadways. And I think it's significant, 80,000 serious injuries from crashes. And we know that if we have safer roads, we're going to have fewer crashes. And so it's important to invest in that. So that's kind of the background. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about what the legislature did in the last session. It's really the last two sessions. We'll start with the basis of how they defined the needs. What's the gap in funding? And so Governor Rick Perry, back in the late 2000, and they completed in 2010, established a blue ribbon panel called the 2030 Committee. And that group looked at what the forecast growth in the state was going to be, where we are right now, and projected the future transportation needs in terms of revenue. And what they came up with is that in the near term, we have a $5 billion a year gap. That is to keep conditions at 2010 levels. So that means whatever it was in 2010 in terms of the level of congestion, the quality of the maintenance of the facility and the repair of our bridges and roads is frozen in time. And that would perpetuate, but you'd have to come up with additional $5 billion a year. So there are kind of three strategies that they approached it with. First is the elimination of diversions. And I want to talk about the diversion question because they did make significant steps towards taking money that was coming in from the fuel tax, for example, and registration fees, and that were going to non-highway functions. They directed that back to the state highway fund. However, the state fuel tax, which is 20 cents a gallon, a fixed amount on every gallon of gas that you purchase, 5 cents of that, 20 cents, continues to go to public education. And that was not on the table as a discussion to change that. But all the other diversions were all redirected back into the state highway fund. And then there were two significant constitutional amendments, referenda. One was in November 2014, and that was to transfer money from the Economic Stabilization Fund, or we call it the Rainy Day Fund. This is supported by oil and gas severance taxes. And so a portion of that every year goes to transportation. There's a lot of formulas and the way they set the threshold, and I'm not going to get into those details, but that's part of that gap that they tried to fill. And that was approved by the voters. I think the margin was over 80%. That was last November. And then just this week, Proposition 7 was passed by the voters, again at a very high margin, over 80%, to dedicate a portion of both the sales tax and the vehicle sales tax to transportation, beginning in 2018 for the sales tax, 2020 for the vehicle sales tax. Again, there's some formulas in the way it works. There's a certain money that's going to the general fund, the general revenue first, and then there's amounts over that get directed to the state highway fund. That's at about $2.8 billion a year. So they're starting to get closer to that $5 billion a year gap number. So what does that look like now? I say now, but this is the forecast for 2020, and this is what our revenue picture looks like. We've got some strange numbers up. Okay. So we have the fuel tax, the state fuel tax, at 20 cents a gallon, with, again, a portion of that going to public education. We have registration fees for a passenger car is a little over $50. We have federal funds that come from the federal fuel tax. We have borrowing and debt, and I will say that the gap up to this point has been largely filled with debt financing, but the legislature took action this time to reduce the amount of borrowing. In fact, we're not doing any more borrowing, and we're working on repaying the debt. And then you can see the Proposition 1 and the Proposition 7, which is called Series 7 up there for some reason. So what you don't see up here is toll financing, and that's because it's not considered a revenue source per se. What it is that it's a tool that's used on individual projects to pay the cost of those projects or to support the cost of those projects, and then the money that's generated in tolls goes to pay those specific projects. What it does is it takes those projects then off of the highway system or off of the list of needs, and so there's more money to apply to other projects, particularly those that where tolling doesn't seem to be a viable option. This is another way of looking at it. This is the highway contracts that have been let up to this point, and then also projected forward. So what you see in the green line is kind of that fuel tax, that traditional funding. And you can see over the last few years, the red is the debt financing, so you can see where the debt has come into play. But moving forward from, and then the tallest line there is 2015, that we're in probably the heaviest construction activities that we've seen for a long time. But moving forward, you see the other kinds of funding sources that come in, the Prop 1, the Prop 7, and the redirection of the diverted money back into the State Highway Fund. So this is another way of looking at it. It's not, again, a huge increase over what we've done before. You're replacing debt with some new sources, but you're getting what I think the legislature wanted to do is some dedicated, reliable funding over the long term, so that, and particularly in highway projects that take a long time for planning, development, construction, implementation, having that dedicated source of funding is important to be able to continue to do the work that needs to be done. So I just want to also put this up there, and this is showing where Texas ranks with some of these more traditional forms of transportation highway funding. 29th on the fuel tax nationally, 19th on vehicle registration fees. Very low on the cost of vehicle ownership, because other states include vehicle fees such as property taxes, excise taxes, vehicle license tax fees, other things. We don't have those in Texas, so we're very low on the vehicle ownership scale. All right, so let's kind of shift focus to what's ahead. So again, the goal that our policymakers have had is having a dedicated and reliable source of funding. And what we've done is gone from being relying on fuel taxes, both at the state and federal level, vehicle registration fees and debt, to now expanding to sales taxes and the rainy day fund. So what we have to keep in mind is that a number of these are going to have variability over time. So take, for instance, Prop 1 comes out of the oil and gas severance taxes. If there's a turn in the oil and gas business, in the industry, and the taxes coming in, then there's going to be a lower amount going to transportation. If there's any changes in the economy, it's just going to affect how much goes to transportation. But the debt is going away. I mean, we are clearly moving away from that, and I think, as my colleague Trey will show you, is that one of the things that people found most problematic when we talked to them is the amount of debt that the state had taken on for transportation. What we're going to see over time, though, is some issues with the fuel tax, which continues to be over 40% of the funding picture. And this is kind of also speaks to the problems that we've had with the fuel tax and how we've gotten into the situation that we're in now. So what I'm showing here is a chart that shows you the purchasing power of the gas tax over time. So the last time that the gas tax, the state tax, was raised in Texas is 1991. So you'll see it 20 cents a gallon there. By 2013, because of inflation, the fuel tax, instead of purchasing 20 cents of construction of highway, it's now purchasing 7.2 cents of construction because of the inflation effects. Same thing with the federal fuel tax, last raised in 93 at 18.4 cents. That's how much construction it could buy in 1993. Now only can buy 6.6 cents of construction. So that's probably one of the main difficulties that we had in trying to keep up with the level of demand. So what you see is the effect of this inflation is a $500 million road project built in 2010 now is costing you $750 million, and in 2019 will cost $923 million. So we're fighting against inflation in order to get these projects on the ground. The other thing that we're seeing, obviously, too, is the effect of increasing vehicle fuel efficiency. As vehicles become more fuel efficient, which you see in the bottom line, the blue line going up, that means less fuel consumed. Fewer gallons of gas means fewer tax revenues coming in, and so there's also that effect. So what we're seeing in the gas tax over time, that even though the state of Texas will continue to grow, we'll continue to have more vehicles on the roadway, we're seeing a flattening of this fuel tax curve, if you will, and at some point it's going to peak and start declining. Now, I don't have it up here because we're still working on it, but we're preparing a graph right now for the legislature that shows fuel tax, all of these revenue sources, what the projection is over time, and then what the 2030 report, back to that established the needs, shows as the needs over time as our population and economy continues to grow. And what you will see from that graph is that although the legislature and the policymakers have closed that gap right now, that gap gets bigger over time. And so we're now in the discussion of, how do we close the average annual gap above what we've done now of $4.3 billion per year over the next 20 years. And a $5.5 billion a year gap if we say we're not doing any more toll roads. Okay, so right now there is the House Transportation Committee has a subcommittee on long-term infrastructure funding that is now diving into this issue, understanding that over the long term we continue to have a gap, and what are the strategies that Texans want to see to continue to have the transportation system that we enjoy and that supports our economy, and how do they want to pay for it, and how do they want to see it implemented over time. And with that, thank you very much for inviting me, and if we have time for questions, I look forward to that. Thank you.